Thank you very much indeed, Owen, and thank you, Anya, as well. Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see you all here. We're a little bit depleted in numbers because of the tube strike, unfortunately, but hopefully people will be arriving to join us during the day. But thank you all very much indeed for coming. It's my pleasure this morning to be introducing our subject for the day, a human rights-centred approach to addressing modern slavery and human trafficking. Now, those of you who know the Policy and Evidence Centre, the PEC as our acronym, a rather ugly acronym, refers us to, will know that we've always taken a human rights-based approach to addressing modern slavery and human trafficking. And the clue, of course, is in the name. We are, and we have been since we were created in 2019 by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Policy and Evidence Centre on Modern Slavery and Human Rights. So I want to introduce the subject matter of our conference today by posing or asking you all to reflect on a central question. What does a human rights-centred approach to modern slavery actually mean in practice? It's a phrase which we hear used a lot, tossed around a lot, but I want to focus on what it actually means in practice, and in particular focus on what it means at this particular political moment. Now, in the literature, a human rights-based approach to modern slavery policy is generally contrasted with one which is focused on legal enforcement, on the prosecution of traffickers and securing border control. And on this view, a human rights-based approach focuses on the individual rights of the exploited rather than the public interest in prosecution of the exploiters or the enforcement of laws against trafficking. Now, I want to suggest that this is a false dichotomy which we need to urgently revisit. It's part of a wider problem with the way in which human rights are framed in public discourse, in which they're treated as individualistic entitlements which have to be asserted against the countervailing rights of the majority. And that framing makes it easy for critics to conflate modern slavery protections with human rights laws, which are increasingly characterized as operating to protect unworthy groups at the expense of, to use the language of the critics, the law-abiding majority, or as obstacles to businesses and their pursuit of economic growth and prosperity, as we see in recent reports from the Prosperity Institute and from Policy Exchange. Now, that's a narrative about human rights which has firmly taken hold, driven by a hostile media and by populist political parties who are very adept at polarizing narratives. Modern slavery laws have been sucked into this political framing, steadily eroding the cross-party consensus, which until relatively recently they'd continued to enjoy, even as human rights debates became increasingly politically polarized. So one question I want to invite you all to reflect on is whether this means we should stop thinking and talking about modern slavery as a human rights issue. And I'll be very upfront about my view on that central question, which is that it's an emphatic no. This shouldn't stop us thinking about modern slavery as a human rights issue. And the reason for that mainly is because, in fact, human rights laws, properly understood, are about much more than protecting individual rights against majorities. They also require the state to take positive action to protect ordinary people against exploitation by concentrations of private power. Now, that means that human rights law requires the putting in place of effective legal frameworks which both prevent exploitation by addressing its structural reasons and causes, and at the same time which provide for a range of legal consequences when prevention fails. And those consequences include criminal prosecution of traffickers and other effective remedies for people when they are exploited, including adequate compensation. The legal consequences are central to making prevention effective. They go hand in hand. And that's why it's a public scandal, of course, that there have so far been no prosecutions of any of the men who are now known to have exploited young women and girls as part of the Epstein sex trafficking ring, and why it continues to be unacceptable that obstacles to prosecution for exploitation offences generally remain so high and convictions remain so low. A human rights-centred approach to addressing modern slavery and human trafficking requires accountability for perpetrators, including through criminal prosecution, as well as by ensuring adequate compensation for those exploited, to give them a fighting chance of rebuilding their lives. But a truly human rights-centred approach also requires preventive approaches to all forms of exploitation. child criminal exploitation through a combination of proactive identification of those at risk involving schools and social services, as well as effective criminal laws which are actually enforced. Labour exploitation to ensure that minor forms of exploitation do not turn into more extreme forms of exploitation. And the creation, of course, of the Fair Work Agency, which finally came into being this month, marks an important step in this direction, and we're pleased to be working closely with them. Online sexual exploitation by more effective regulation of the tech giants and use of the criminal and civil law against them when they fail. And a proper human rights-centred approach also requires stronger regulation to require businesses to do more to ensure that their supply chains are not tainted by modern slavery or other human rights abuses. So a human rights-centred approach is not just about ensuring that the individual rights of victims can be legally vindicated. It's also about a strong and confident state introducing the effective policies and legal frameworks which facilitate a more proactive approach to protecting people against multiple forms of exploitation. That's the approach that we take at the PEC, and it explains the focus of the sessions at today's conference. So to conclude, as a human rights lawyer, which those of you who know the PEC know that I am, I recognise that human rights as a discourse currently faces a serious legitimacy crisis. But that doesn't mean that we should stop talking about modern slavery as a human rights issue. Rather, it means that we have to win that wider argument about human rights. And in this respect, modern slavery policy has got a lot to teach human rights policy more generally. Modern slavery is in many ways the quintessential human rights issue of our time, in which people are exploited not by the state itself, but by the privately powerful, whether organised criminals, people traffickers, unscrupulous employers or businesses, usually as a result of inadequate regulation. So human rights policy has a lot to learn from the legal and policy responses to modern slavery. And how we talk about modern slavery policy in turn has a lot to learn from the extensive work which has been done and which continues to be done on how to frame talk about human rights in today's hostile and toxic information environment, in a way which makes it about protecting everyone's children against the risk of criminal exploitation, everyone's daughters against online harm, and everyone's relatives against unscrupulous employers. And if we listen attentively to the lived experience of those who have suffered such exploitation, as any human rights-centred approach requires us, of course, to do, that is precisely the approach that we hear being advocated. That brings me to my next very pleasant task, which is to introduce a short video by Jane Lasonda to introduce the first panel session. Jane will be known to all of you. She is a member of our Lived Experience Advisory Panel and was also recently appointed Chair of ISTAC, the International Survivors of Trafficking Advisory Council of the OSCE. She does a lot of great work, both nationally and internationally, to ensure that lived experience is genuinely at the heart of policy discussion about modern slavery. She's contributed to the work here of IASC and many others. Everyone in the room, I'm sure, has worked with Jane in one way or another, as well as the key international standard setters that work in this policy area. She is the living embodiment of so much that we're trying to do at the PEC, and we continue to enjoy the great privilege of working with her. So, Owen, with that, I'll hand over to Jane, who will now speak to you through the screen. Thank you all very much indeed. I hope you have a very fruitful day.
Good morning, everyone. It's an honour to speak to you all today, even though it's only through the screen. We are at a defining moment with the government revisiting the Modern Slavery Act and the NRM. We have a massive opportunity to set a new agenda for the UK. But let's be very clear. For a human rights-centred approach to mean anything at all, it has to be rooted in reality, and that reality is the survivor. Speaking today for the Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Centre, the LEAP, the Lived Experience Advisory Panel, I see every day that we are not just people who need support or help. We are leaders, we have expertise. We are the ones who knew exactly where the system is broken, because we are the ones who had to navigate it. We need a vision that actually lasts. That means moving beyond the idea that ethical behaviour is optional. We need mandatory due diligence in our businesses. We cannot leave the protection of vulnerable people up to the good mood of a CEO or some voluntary corporate policy. The government must hold businesses accountable through the law. We need real ethical accountability that ensures exploitation cannot thrive in the first place. And part of that accountability is making sure survivors have a permanent seat at the table, like setting up a National Survivor of Trafficking Advisory Council. And honestly, I don't know why it hasn't even happened yet. But today we can take a stand. Let's commit to this right now so that the survivor voices are built into the very structure of our national responses. When we ask what new legislation should look like, the answer has to come from a people who have lived it. A survivor-centred approach is not just a buzzword or a tick box exercise. It's about making our expertise the foundation of every single policy and law we write from here on out. We are about to dive into exactly how we make this happen. I'm so proud to lead you into the next discussion, where we will discuss how to ensure the UK's future is truly built on survivor expertise. The expertise is in this room now. The solutions are on the table. Now we just need the courage to act on them. No empty promises. Let's get to work. I now hand over to the panel to get this vital conversation started.
Please join me in virtually thanking Jane for that contribution. And now we're very delighted to welcome up to the stage our first panel, a survivor-centred approach to preventing and addressing modern slavery in the UK, chaired by Eleanor Lyons, the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner. Please welcome our first panel.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear us okay? Okay, fantastic. Well, we're really excited to be here, and we've just had a green room session to get ourselves all in the mood to come speak to you about survivor engagement. So it's fantastic to see you all, and especially on a tube strike day. I'm very impressed at how packed the room is. So good morning, everyone. For those of you who I haven't met, I'm Eleanor Lyons, and I'm the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner. It's my role to provide independent scrutiny and leadership in our response to modern slavery. It's great to be here at the Modern Slavery PET conference to discuss implementing a survivor-led approach to addressing modern slavery and human trafficking. As everyone in this room will know, modern slavery is a deeply disturbing crime and incredibly personal to those who experience it. Unfortunately, far too often, responses to exploitation rely on assumptions about survivors, not their real experiences. When this happens, even well-informed and well-intentioned policies have consequences that can create further harm to those who have already been exploited. The survivor-led approach challenges us to shift that power to those who have been impacted by the harm. We must listen with intent to those who have real lived experience of exploitation. This does not mean storytelling of their exploitation, but genuinely embedding survivor voice and leadership at every stage of policy development. Survivors must be at the table from the idea stage right through to the implementation. Only then can we ensure that change in this space is going to have a positive impact for survivors. As Commissioner, Survivor Voice has been critical to my work. Last month, I held a roundtable with 13 lived experience panels. Each panel presented their priority areas of action, and I have listened to these asks and actively designed my work for the next year around what survivors have asked for. I believe that the government must do the same. I've repeatedly asked the government, as Jane mentioned when she so powerfully spoke, to implement a survivor council to inform their decision-making. I'm aware that some survivor engagement has taken place, but there needs to be broader, permanent, empowered survivor councils to systemically inform policy development. And that's why I'm so pleased that we have this panel today We're joined by a fantastic team of experts, and I'm pleased it's an all-woman get-together. Ollie, Alicia, Ella and Tatiana, and each of these panellists have made incredible contributions to policy research and frontline support for survivors of modern slavery, and we're very lucky to have you all here today. I'm just going to ask each of the panellists to make a very brief introduction about who they are so you know who you are hearing from. Please go ahead.
Hi everyone, my name is Alicia, also known as Ollie. I'm an expert by experience. I've been working at the PEC for almost the last 3 years, and I lead on our lived experience engagement strand of work, so it's lovely to be here today and to speak to you all.
Hi everyone. Does this work? I can speak louder. Yeah, so I'm Tatiana, now it works, and I am the head of policy and advocacy for justice and care, but I've been around for a very long time, now coming up to nearly 15 years working for the Human Trafficking Foundation to start with, and then the Office of the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner. So have met many of you here, but also looking forward to meeting some of you who I haven't.
Hi, I'm Ella Cobain. I'm a professor of human trafficking and exploitation at UCL, kicking around for pretty much the same amount of time as Tatiana by now, and currently co-leading on a project on labour market exploitation. So if that's an area that's of interest to you, we've got a conference with the Fair Work Agency coming up in a month's time. More info in my bio. Sorry for the shameless plug. Just figured an overlap of interest.
Hi, I'm Alicia Hayes. I'm a reader in modern slavery based at the Wilberforce Institute at the University of Hull, and I'm one of the co-leads at the Modern Slavery PEC, where I lead the research stream on the legal enforcement of modern slavery.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. So as you can see, we're joined by a great panel. I'm really excited to hear their contributions. I'm going to ask everyone some questions, and then there will be some time at the end for any reflections from the room. So just to start off with Ollie, Survivor Voice is grounded in listening to those with real experience. Please could you explain the importance of bringing Survivor Voice to government, to first responders, to policymakers generally, and to other survivors too? How can the government give genuine power to survivors through this process?
Yeah, as you sort of mentioned earlier about assumptions, you know, without survivor voice, without, you know, that input, we are just making assumptions around what the needs are of survivors. Yeah, and just thinking about sort of going forward and including survivors in these spaces, you know, in order to be having meaningful input, it's not just about commenting on policy, you know, it's about bringing survivors in to closely shape policy. You know, survivors, it's empowering for survivors to be involved in this space, you know, and I think we're kind of at a stage now, you know, just thinking about how we involve and include survivors meaningfully. It's going beyond just including survivors now. We need to be bringing them in on a closer scale. We need to be thinking about career pathways going forward for survivors. What does that look like? I think we need to be having more conversations about that. I think we need to be thinking about tokenism as well. In the last sort of 5 years, I mean, I sort of came into the sector in 2017. I've seen a lot happen in that time. You know, I came from destitution, and now I've found myself working in the sector. And there are so many survivors out there who are looking for opportunities, looking for ways to be included in the space, and thinking about, well, how can we do that meaningfully now? We need government to be thinking about co-production and what levels of co-production actually look like. So yeah, that's what I would say, you know, sort of going forward, food for thought. I think a bigger conversation needs to be had around that if we're going to be progressing into real, meaningful, genuine survivor engagement.
Thank you. And so do you think the overall direction of travel since 2017, when you came in, has been a positive, more inclusive one for survivors? Some of the things you mentioned about assumptions, career pathways, properly embedding survivors. Hopefully, from what you were saying, sounds like you feel like some progress has been made,
Yes.
but there's further to go. Would that be a fair?
Yeah, I do. I think we've still got a long way to go. I think, you know, when I reflect back, at least on my journey in the sector, you know, it was all about we need to include survivors, and we've been doing that, and that's a great step that we have taken, but there is more that can be done now, and I think there needs to be a shift, and we need to be having bigger conversations about sharing power and what does that actually look like in practice. Yeah.
So food for thought to take forward, I think, in our work and today about actually what meaningful engagement means. And I think that's actually something that you've rightly highlighted in terms of it just not being a token involvement. Tatiana, moving on to some of the specifics with you about survivor-led policy, it'd be great to hear from you about how we involve survivors in decision-making, rather than survivors being used to tell stories of trauma and harm. Can you share your views on how you think we could best engage with survivors in a way that is authentic and impactful? And what do you think success looks like in this space?
Thanks, Eleanor. Well, it's a tough question, I guess, and I'm not the right person to give the specifics, because I think that's where we need survivors to tell us what that would look like for them. And yes, it's true that too often survivors are invited to share stories, or have been invited to share stories. But I think that authentic and meaningful engagement is about giving them the opportunity to influence those priorities, to design solutions together with policymakers, to evaluate outcomes as well, not just to provide their testimony. And I think that, as Ollie said, I think that we have been seeing a major shift, and I'm actually proud to be living through the times where we are seeing that shift in terms of survivor engagement and inclusion. And thanks also, Eleanor, to all your work that you've done pushing the government to actually have their own survivor advisory board. So things are definitely moving, I think, in the right direction. And in the next couple of weeks, or I will use a very famous word in the policy circles, imminently, we're about to publish a report. And when I say we, it's not just Justice and Care. And I'm privileged again today to speak on behalf of many organizations. It's not just me who were involved in the last year in a project that we call Developing a Strategic Vision for the next 5 to 10 years for the government, that we co-produced jointly with lived experience experts, facilitated by the organizations that work directly with the panel. So they had the opportunity to feed into that report that we're going to put out in the next couple of weeks, hopefully, and that sets out that strategic vision for the government for the next 5 to 10 years. And we've all asked government for a new cross-departmental strategy, but we rarely said what should be in it. So this is our first attempt to say and provide our vision for what should be in it, and give recommendations both long-term and short-term with a roadmap to different departments in terms of what they should be doing. And hopefully we can then push jointly for this to happen. We've had more than 18 leading anti-slavery charities contributing to this piece of work, but also more than 12 that have signed up to it, showing its support to the messages that are there. But back to this conversation in particular, the proposed strategic vision mandates that meaningful and ethical survivor inclusion is the cornerstone of all policy design in the future, recognizing survivors as key experts in the field. And I'm going to read this out, although I hate reading out from my notes, but I'm not going to do it justice otherwise. So our vision of what success should look like, our vision for 2036 is that lived and learned experience will be fully embedded in the design of modern slavery policy across all of government. Consultation and co-production take place in a meaningful, trauma-informed manner, that value survivor insight as professional expertise. Survivors are equitably remunerated without facing financial or legal penalties, and a cross-departmental culture exists where inclusive participation fosters transparency, long-term impact, and the constant improvement of the UK's anti-slavery response. And this is the vision that was produced in consultation and designed with the lived experience experts. So the paper also explores the barriers and the challenges, but also provides solutions and a roadmap how to achieve this vision that I've just read out. And it is underpinned, again, by the work of all of us pretty much here, because it also recommends resources such as MSPEC, Lived Experience Toolkit, as well as the HTF Survivor Care Standards that, again, were produced by a group of something like 150 organizations. So I'm really privileged to speak almost on behalf of the sector in terms of what this vision should look like and what the success should look like.
Thank you, Tatiana. And I think just to acknowledge the work that's gone into this work and the 10-year vision, Tatiana's done a fantastic job of bringing people together to actually create quite a hopeful vision of what we can all aim for when we're tackling modern slavery and human trafficking. Personally, I think that's a very pertinent thing to do at a time when often it feels like the government is going in the opposite direction to the one that we would want them to. So it's really positive that we have a message which is actually not just about policy, but shaped by lived experience. And I think it's an example of what we can all do moving forward. So I'm going to ask Tatiana a leading question in terms of, are you hopeful for your 10-year vision?
I wouldn't be in this job if I wasn't.
Okay, good.
There were so many moments in my career where the hope was at its lowest, but I am always hopeful, because otherwise I can't do my job.
Perfect. So I think hopefully we're highlighting, actually, when you listen to survivor voices and embed them in the work, actually some of that blue sky, hopeful thinking of where we want to be in 10 years is actually something that we can all get behind and take forward. Ella, moving on to you on a slightly different topic for us to bring to life, this from every angle. Often we talk about prosecutions and action after individuals have been trafficked, but what more is there that could be done in supporting the prevention of harm before it occurs? How can the government support prevention through a survivor-led approach?
Thanks. I mean, actually talking about prevention in the first place is good progress. For a really long time, prevention has been the kind of neglected part of the 3Ps framework. And also thinking about prevention in public health terms, so primary prevention before harm's done, secondary prevention targeted at sort of where issues have started to develop, early intervention, and tertiary prevention around preventing re-trafficking as well are all really important, I think. As the focus on prevention grows, because I would argue it's still relatively minimal, there's a real opportunity to build in survivors and impacted communities more broadly from the start. And when I say impacted communities, I mean here those who are affected both by human trafficking or modern slavery, but also by anti-trafficking interventions, because there's a long and increasingly well-documented history of harming while trying to help that needs to be avoided. So there's a chance to build this up from the start with the voices of the people most affected. And to do that, we need to build a much stronger evidence base on what is actually effective in prevention, under what circumstances, by what mechanisms, what are the risks, the costs, etc. And here really involving survivors and impacted communities at all stages. So like Ollie and Tatiana have said, you know, in the design of interventions, in the implementation, in the evaluation, actually being part of the conversation around setting what are the metrics for success, rather than coming in later and being used in a sort of tokenizing way. So having that meaningful engagement that Jane, Ollie, Eleanor, Tatiana have all spoken to avoid it being tokenizing, to share power, to recognize that there's a huge amount of variety under the modern slavery umbrella, and that we really need to disaggregate here and not expect that a person with one particular experience can speak for all people, and actually having a real kind of variety of voices at the table, properly compensated, engaging with the broader communities affected by anti-trafficking interventions, be that, trade unions for precarious workers, domestic worker collectives, be that sex worker-led organisations, depending on the particular interventions in question, and really sharing power, like Ollie said, I think are some of the important steps here.
Thank you. And I've also heard some MPs and policymakers beginning to adopt the language of a public health approach. Do you mind explaining to the room what that would look like, what we mean when we reference that?
Yeah, so essentially, you're looking to do good and minimise harm, effectively. You're coming at things from a systems approach, so shifting away from positioning trafficking and anti-trafficking first and foremost as a criminal justice issue, looking at those linkages across, looking at the different levels of prevention, like I said. So what can you do at a more sort of general or targeted at particular population subgroups to avoid harm in the first place? What can you do as harm is developing to minimize the impacts, maximize the sort of ways out of it, support people properly? And like I said, what you can do afterwards to help people to move on, recover, find opportunities, avoid falling back into these situations, because unfortunately we have some really problematic histories in this country of where people have been trafficked, have managed to escape the trafficking themselves with huge courage and huge sort of initiative, and then ended up in a situation of destitution, homelessness, pretty much nearly as precarious, if not arguably more precarious in some situations than during the trafficking activity itself. So really finding those intervention points, pinpointing them, working with people who understand the dynamics involved to try and address that in a way that minimizes, like you said, collateral damage, because sometimes unintended consequences are genuinely unintended. Sometimes they're entirely foreseeable and they have been foreseen and warned against, but those with the most power aren't listening to people raising these warnings. And that's more, I would argue, a sort of collateral damage that just really isn't acceptable. And I think from a public health model, generally is a bit better at recognizing and accepting and acting on those risks.
Thank you, and I completely agree, and thank you for taking the time to outline that broad impact, because I think, as you rightly recognise, the forms of exploitation that people can experience require a very broad response, both in prevention and also helping in the recovery journey. It's not one size fits all, and I think by including survivors, we're consistently reminded of that. So thank you for explaining that so eloquently. Moving on to the final question before we open up to the room. Alicia, in cases of exploitation, we expect the criminal justice system to take action against the perpetrators. You have written a lot of extensive research into the legal enforcement of modern slavery and the use of the Modern Slavery Act. Could you share your thoughts on how effective the criminal justice response is to ensuring that survivors have achieved justice from their traffickers, and what should be done to improve the response further?
Thank you. I think I'm basically going to reword everything that Ella said and apply it to this question.
Great.
So justice doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to the practitioners that are applying it as to the survivors who are experiencing the criminal justice system. And there isn't very much research out there at the moment on what a good criminal justice outcome looks like to survivors. So that's one thing that we're researching through the Policy and Evidence Centre at the moment. So a plug for future research. Hopefully we'll have a publication looking into that by the end of the year. But when we look at the criminal justice system, there tends to be the assumption that a good outcome is a conviction, and that's where the focus tends to go. But we know that conviction rates under the Modern Slavery Act are still relatively low. And that's not to say that we're not seeing convictions, but convictions might be being pursued under other legislation. And this is really difficult, and I've been really grappling with this myself recently in terms of, well, is that enough? Is a conviction enough for a good outcome? But going to what Ella was saying is, what are the metrics for success? And is a conviction under one piece of legislation okay if it doesn't reflect the survivor's experience? So if we're pursuing a conviction under a drugs offence instead of the Modern Slavery Act, well, on the one hand, it can be a positive because we see a conviction of potentially a sentence. On the other hand, it can not properly represent the experience that the survivor had in their exploitation. It can underrepresent the prevalence of a modern slavery offence, which then can have follow-on impacts on resource allocation. So if an investigation is taking 8 years and it's not getting a conviction under a modern slavery legislation, then the people who hold the purse strings aren't going to want to allocate money to modern slavery investigations in the future. So do we continue to investigate under that legislation and push for that conviction in the hope that it's going to continue that resource allocation? And also, convictions under other pieces of legislation leave us without access to some of the key provisions provided by the Modern Slavery Act. So things like the slavery and trafficking prevention orders and slavery and trafficking reparation orders, which are only available on conviction of a modern slavery offence, but are really valuable tools. They're massively underused, but they can be really valuable for providing other forms of justice. So where we're looking at reparations that goes beyond a conviction, and this is where we need to make sure we're not just stopping at conviction, because that doesn't necessarily equate to justice. And we need to better understand what a positive outcome and a successful outcome is, not only from the criminal justice system perspective, but from the survivor's perspective. And I don't want to fall into the trap of every report that I've ever written that's like, we need more training, we need more resources. We all know that. So if I was to suggest one thing that we could do better, it would be more financial investigations. So we rely so heavily on survivor testimony to get to a prosecution or a conviction, and we know how burdensome that is. That's not new to us, and it's not unique to modern slavery. But if we're relying on that survivor testimony, that's meaning that we're putting extra pressure on survivors, and they're being told that we can't get a prosecution without your input. So that's so much pressure. Whereas financial investigations can provide us with corroborative evidence that can reduce that burden, also helps us to identify the proceeds of crime, which then can be frozen, can be seized, and can be used in confiscation orders and reparation orders that can then lead us to a better justice outcome.
Thank you. And Alyssa's research is completely invaluable because she also joins the CPS scrutiny panel and puts all her extensive research into practice with improving criminal justice response on the ground, which is the perfect combination of research and application and action. So thank you for all the work that you do, and I completely agree with you about financial investigations. If anyone wants to speak to someone else about this, Amelia and my team is doing a big piece of work on it at the moment, so please go harass her in the coffee break and offer your thoughts. I'm sure she'll very much welcome them.